Chapter 5, Paraguay, 2001. Dieter von Rossbach shifted in his saddle, irritated by the turn of events that had drawn him from his office to the edge of this stagnant mud hole. Mosquitoes whined through the hot, still air of the Chaco summer. Reeds stood still in the scummy green water of the marsh. Birds flicked by like living jewels, but no matter how many of the insects they ate, there always seemed to be more. He took off his baseball cap and ran a hand over his short blonde brush cut, just starting to go a little gray at the temples, and looked down at his overseer from atop his massive horse. The horse needed to be big. The Austrian was over 6 feet tall, big-boned and muscular, with the sort of sculpted muscle that only a scientifically designed exercise program can produce. His neighbors and employees thought he was a physical fitness fanatic, which was true enough. He'd gotten that way under mercilessly perfectionist instructors, though. "What is she even doing here?" he demanded, steely blue eyes snapping, a muscle jumping in his strong jaw, visible even through the short beard he wore. Epifanio Garcia, Dieter's overseer, rose from where he's been squatting on his heels and shrugged, his dark walnut face bland. "She's a cow, Senor von Rossbach. She wants to be with her sisters." The cow in question was definitely not with her sisters at the moment, unless she was standing on them. She was chest deep and possibly sinking deeper into a disgusting and smelly bog. The cow bawled her distress, big eyes rolling in terror, showing the whites all around. "She's supposed to be locked up in a paddock," von Rossbach said coldly. "Some of them are escape artists, senor. This one is smart. For a cow." Epifanio sucked his teeth and shook his head. "That's not awfully bright, of course. Just smart enough to get into trouble." Grimacing, Dieter considered the cow. He had plans for her. She was supposed to be the mother of a hybrid that would produce meatier, fatter cattle that could endure the privations of the Chaco. He was awaiting a shipment of sperm from the King Ranch in the United States so he could get started. Meanwhile, he'd ordered her and 3 others, separated from the main herd, so that they would stay healthy. She was definitely sinking deeper. Judging from the tone of her last bellow, she knew it too. Dieter allowed himself an exasperated sigh. "Well, I guess we'd better get her out." Epifanio, in a few economical movements, had his lariat dropping over the panicked cow's horns, down over her throat. He wrapped it a couple of times around his saddle horn and backed his horse, pulling the cow's head up and not noticeably improving her mood. "I don't really want to strangle her," Dieter said. "I just want to get her out." The overseer smiled and waved his arm expressively at the near-buried bovine. "There's nothing else to drop a rope on, senor," he said. "I'm just trying to keep her from sinking any further. What we're going to have to do..." "We're going to have to get in there with her," von Rossbach agreed. Epifanio nodded. "And she's going to kick the hell out of us, too," the overseer grimaced. "Okay, strangle her," Dieter muttered. Epifanio gave his boss a sidelong glance, not sure whether he was serious or not. "I know what to do," Dieter said, dismounting. He took his own rope, and after tying one end to his saddle horn, he handed his reins to his overseer. "Don't let him walk off," he said with a meaningful look, which Epifanio returned with one of cherubic innocence. Then von Rossbach walked toward the bog. At the end of the stinking, scum-covered quagmire, he took off his boots and socks. He was certain to lose them to suction if he didn't. It should be safe enough to put his bare feet in the muck. There were a number of poisonous snakes and insects in this country, but in all probability, very few of them could live under a meter of slime. He seriously considered taking off his trousers, but decided that would make too good a story, especially if he were to lose his underwear to the mud. Taking a deep breath, he stepped in. It was cool and far from smooth. He could feel things sliding through his toes. Very quickly, Dieter was up to his knees and realizing that the smell was even worse that he'd found it on the shore, as if the earth itself had developed a severe case of flatulence. So this is where the bodies are buried. He'd been a village boy himself, born in an alpine hamlet where people were only a generation from living over the cow byres, but he'd left that as soon as he could. 20 years in the big city had dulled his memory of how bad the countryside could smell. He walked toward the cow, making soothing noises, but she reacted with a fresh panic attack. She thrashed and mooed, waving her head around on her strong neck as though trying to reach him with her horns. Stupid beast, he thought. He was easily 2 meters away from her yet. They see differently, he reminded himself. Maybe I look a lot closer. Dieter yanked one foot out of the mud with an audible sucking noise, holding his arms out for balance. He sank it back into the bog and leaned forward to pull out the other one, then flailed for balance as his leg plunged to above the knee. He stood still for a moment as the cow went wild. I guess that would look threatening to a frightened cow, he thought. To her, a human waving his arms with a coil of rope in one hand usually meant she was about to be knocked down, sat on, and branded. Probably not a happy memory. Sometimes, he suspected that they knew why human beings kept them around, too. Pigs certainly did. He refused to have any of those on the estancia. Grimly, he pulled himself forward, forced to lunge now because he was up to his waist in muck. At last, he grabbed onto Epifanio's rope and pulled himself along. Finally, he was there. The cow bawled for help, eyes rolling. Dieter wound up and smacked her in the middle of the forehead with a massive balled fist. Her head fell to the side with a drawn-out moo, like a tired, squeaky toy. Then she lay with eyes half closed, her steam engine panting, slowing to a steady, deep whoosh, whoosh. Epifanio's eyes went wide, and his mouth dropped open. Clearly, those muscles weren't just for show. Meanwhile, Dieter, up to his chest in mud, pushed the rope halfway around her loins. Then he dragged himself over to her other side, and after an unpleasant and all too long episode with his nose almost under the stinking mud, he found the rope again and dragged it through. Then he labored back to the forequarters of the cow, squatting and reaching down until his hands closed around the big cannon bones. He clamped them tight, took a deep breath, then straightened, pulling with legs and gut. That drove him deeper, but eventually the mud gave way with a deep sucking sound, and the semi-conscious cow came up to lie with its mud-caked forelegs flat on the surface of the swamp. Then he tied off the rope and signaled to his overseer to back the horses. He held onto Epifanio's rope, and when they got into the shallows, he pushed her over on her side and slid the rope down over her forequarters, allowing them to drag her out completely. By the time she was on dry land, she was starting to come to, but was very subdued. Her head wobbled on her muddy neck, and she blinked in confusion. "She's going to have a rotten headache, and a pretty sore stomach," Epifanio observed. "She's lucky she's feeling anything," Dieter said. "I think she would have gone under in another hour." "Less than that, senor. I almost went under myself. When I was young and so stupid, I went in after a cow by myself." "Perhaps we should drain it," Dieter said thoughtfully. "See, you could do that," Epifanio agreed. "But it would be a big, expensive job, and at most we lose a cow or two a year to the mud. It would take a lot of cows to make such an expense worthwhile." Dieter gave him a considering look. "Then I'll have to see if I can't think saddle," to the annoyance of his horse, who whickered approval at the stench of its rider. "Well, I'm not going to walk barefoot through that grass, horse, with all those snakes and scorpions hiding in there. I'm not going to ruin my boots from the inside instead of the outside," he thought. "You'll just have to get over it." "I'll leave you to bring her back to the paddock," Dieter said, and thumped his bare heels into the horse's sides. Epifanio watched the big man go and shook his head. They'd been nervous when this European showed up to run the estancia. The rumor had been that he'd never run cattle before. More troubling, he turned out to be German. At least, Epifanio thought von Rossbach was German. Things were different over there. It was all cities and snow. So how could he possibly know how to run an estancia? Mennonites were good farmers. There were plenty of them in the Chaco. But von Rossbach was the other variety of German. And while the Germans the overseer knew were very fine people, honest and hard-working, they were also stubborn and determined to have their own way, as well as being very demanding employers. But von Rossbach had worked out wonderfully, better than wonderful. Epifanio had been certain that he, too, would end up covered with reeking muck. But here, he was dry and clean. They didn't make many like Dieter von Rossbach. He sat his horse, waiting for the cow to decide when she wanted to get up, and sucked his teeth as he thought. The boss was always polite, especially to Marietta, the housekeeper, Epifanio's wife. For instance, von Rossbach took care never to swear in her presence. The overseer had heard him swear, and the big man knew some colorful curses, so it was definitely a matter of courtesy, even though Marietta herself swore like a trooper. Epifanio wondered how long the boss would stick around. He learned fast, and he had plans for the estancia, but it was obvious that after only 6 months, he was becoming bored. The cow heaved herself to her feet and stood for a moment on wobbly legs. She gave a juicy snort, then began to nibble some grass. The overseer dropped a rope over her head again and turned to lead her back to her paddock. "Come on, girl," he said. "I'll hose you down and you'll feel much better. Much better." Clean, but still sensing a ghostly whiff of the swamp about his person, Dieter sat at his desk, prepared to pick up where he'd left off. The Casa Grande was old, massive adobe walls, rafters of thick quebracho, axe-breaker trunks. That was one reason he'd bought it when he came looking for a peaceful, quiet place to retire. It had character. The tiles on the roof and floors had been handmade. You could see the slight ripple. This office had windows that opened onto an interior patio, with a fountain and a pale crimson sheet of jacaranda running up a trellis on the opposite wall. Hummingbirds hovered around it. The whole thing was soothing, until you'd been thoroughly soothed. His workspace was utterly modern by contrast, with a state-of-the-art IBM, a nice little satellite uplink dish to give broadband access to the web, and a full suite of equipment. His answering machine was blinking, so he hit the play button and picked up his pen. "Senor von Rossbach?" A young female voice inquired. She paused as though she expected him to answer. "This is the Krieger Trucking Company. We've received a shipment for you from the King Ranch in the United States." She hesitated, as if unsure the message was clear. "It's waiting for you to pick it up?" Another nervous little hesitation. "All right, goodbye." And she hung up. Dieter checked his watch. 2 o'clock. Siesta would be well over by the time he got there. Anyone who expected Paraguayans to do anything during siesta went mad in short order, and he had to admit it. In this climate, the custom made sense. He looked at his neat desk and decided there wasn't anything that desperately needed his attention right now. "Señora Garcia?" he called out, rising from his chair. "Do you need anything in Villa Hayes?" He found her in the kitchen, where she was plucking a chicken for dinner. She wanted him to call her Marietta, and pretended she didn't hear him when he referred to her as Señora. "Do we need anything in Villa Hayes?" he asked again. "See, laundry soap," she said, not looking up. "The kind in the yellow box with the red letters, and matches for the stove." "Anything else?" She usually had a list a foot long. Marietta shook her head. "I'm going into town myself on Monday with Epifanio," she said. "My grandnephew is coming on the bus from Tobati. He's going to work here for you this summer." She grinned up at him. "You'll like him, he's a good boy." If he was as likable as her local nephews, he probably would. But if he was like her local nephews, there would also probably be as much soccer playing as cattle ranching. Dieter's lips quirked up in a smile. What the hell? He could afford it, and they were good kids. Sometimes, just lately, he'd had wistful thoughts about children, not something you even thought about, in his previous profession, where the phrase, giving hostages to fortune, had an unpleasantly literal meaning. "See you later," Dieter said, and headed for his Land Rover. Sarah stared at the second drawer of her desk and sighed. As long as it's there, I'll never get any work done, she told herself. She tightened her lips, and quickly, so that she could change her mind, opened the drawer, took out the flask, and went into the washroom. Without allowing herself to think about it, she opened it and upended the contents into the sink. Sarah came out screwing on the cap and looked up to find Ernesto, giving her a huge sunny smile. He raised one grease-blackened hand in salute, and she returned it. Her own smile a little ironic. One thing that this little struggle had taught her was that she had a fight on her hands. I didn't realize things had gone this far, she thought. Sarah bit her full lower lip and considered the flask. "You want this?" she asked her chief mechanic. His eyebrows went up. "Si, señora," he said, coming over to her. "Gracias." It was a nice flask, smooth steel with a cap that could be used as a cup. "No problemo," she said, smiling as though it wasn't. but Sarah found that she hated to give it up and had to stop herself from yanking it back with a snarl. "I will take good care of it, Senora," Ernesto said anxiously, noting the look in her eyes. Sarah blinked. "I know you will," she said with a wave of her hand. "Enjoy it," she smiled at him. Then she walked back to her office, her heart pounding. At 4:30, Sarah went to the reception area to cover for Melinda's break. She needed a cigarette. She also needed a drink. But she needed a cigarette more. Maybe it was a good idea to give up drinking and smoking together. Have one big torture session instead of two smaller ones. Maybe they'll each cancel out the other's cravings, she thought. I'll be so paralyzed trying to decide which unhealthy thing I want more that by the time I make up my mind, I'll have kicked both habits. She picked up a stack of papers for filing and noticed that her hands were shaking. Would this day ever end? And she was jumpy. If someone dropped something, Ernesto slammed the hood of one of the trucks and she jumped a foot. Sarah held her breath and counted to 20 before her heart rate went back to normal. Then she was suddenly furious. First with Ernesto for slamming and banging things around, then with herself. What was I thinking? How could I let myself get like this? Somewhere deep inside her was the absolute conviction that one day she would need to be on her game, strong and focused. One day it would happen, and she had to be ready. But the logical, sensible, everyday side of her had talked her out of it, at least on a conscious level. She and John and the Terminator had taken care of the problem. They were safe. Everyone was safe. It was over. The bad days were behind them. The running, the asylum, the stockpiling, all over. A crooked smile twisted her lips. Those stockpiles of arms and food baking in deep, well-camouflaged holes throughout the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico would bring in a lot of cash if she were interested in selling them, not to mention the gold coins. She still had contacts that could get rid of them for her and pay her well, keeping her name out of it. But she just couldn't bring herself to do it. Maybe that was why she'd taken to drinking, to shut that part of her up. She'd kept fit. Running even a small farm would help you do that. But she'd gotten sloppy and bored, and she let things slide. Well, it's not too late, Sarah thought. This can be fixed. In a few months, no one will ever know how close I came to losing it. No one but herself, that is. And that's how it should be. "This is Krieger Trucking," a voice said behind her. A voice with a faint accent. A voice that froze every muscle in her body. She hadn't expected this. It's too soon, she thought. I'm not ready. "Hello?" he said again. Sarah turned slowly, trying to keep the terror off her face, knowing that it didn't matter. Her thoughts jumbled together. It could read her fear in other ways. When she saw his face, its face, she couldn't help but gasp. This close, the resemblance was too perfect, too complete. This can't be an accident. "Yes?" she managed to choke out. "I'm looking for..." Sarah broke. She turned and walked away. By the time she hit the corridor that led to the garage, she was running. She knew it had come for her, and she raced through the garage and out into the alley without a backward glance. In her early days in this town, she'd mapped out several escape routes. Now she took the nearest, and she hoped best. Running flat out, she made good use of the twisted alleyways. Dieter stared at the empty space that had just been occupied by a slender woman with short dark hair. Then he reacted, leaping over the counter and giving chase. He didn't recognize her, but she unquestionably knew him. Of course, he wasn't so much disguised as situated in an unlikely place. He'd spent most of his life as a counter-terrorist operative, starting out in an elite unit of the Bundesheer, later working closely with American and Israeli intelligence. He was a good operative, but he was no monster, not one of the mad dog killers of popular fiction. The woman had no reason to fear him, unless she herself was guilty of something horrendous. He was lucky at the first few turns. The ground was wet, and she'd left footprints in the mud. Then the ground began to get hard, and he began to pant. Finally, he came to an open space, surrounded by buildings, seemingly abandoned. He tried doors and windows, but all were securely locked. There were no footprints. Dieter wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around, letting his breathing return to normal. Tomorrow morning, first thing, he thought, back to running 10 miles. He was sweating like a pig. Next thing he knew, he'd have a potbelly. He listened and heard nothing. There were voices in the distance and some traffic, but nothing nearby. A dog stuck its head around one of the buildings and whined at him. "Hey boy," Dieter said, leaning down. The dog came up to him, wagging its tail so hard its whole stern was lashing back and forth. "Did you see her? Huh?" he asked, scratching the mutt's ears. His eyes moved over the surrounding buildings, even as he appeared to be concentrating solely on the dog. "Did you see where she went?" The stray was wiggling in ecstasy as it strained to lick Dieter's hands, and grunting with pleasure when the big man switched to scratching its ruff. "That's a good boy." Dieter assured the animal in the baby-talking voice that even some anti-terrorist operatives used with animals. He straightened up and put his hands on his hips, realizing just a little too late that he might have acquired a new friend. Looking around, von Rossbach tightened his mouth while the dog looked up worshipfully. The woman could be anywhere by now. Probably she'd gone to ground in a previously scouted hiding place. Obviously, he wasn't going to find her here. He looked around at the blank building faces. Unless, that is, he was willing to put time into it, finding a niche somewhere and blending into the scenery until the woman felt safe enough to emerge from hiding. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. No, he was retired. He was no longer obligated to chase everyone who ran. They would know who she was at the trucking company, so that was the logical place to go for information. Besides, he needed that shipment. Sarah watched in the mirror before her, aimed to catch the view through a filthy window, as the man she'd been almost certain was a Terminator reached down to pet the dog. She stood up slowly and let out her breath in a rush, then stood there panting, shaking from adrenaline reaction. Licking her lips, she tried to think what to do. If a dog can tolerate him, he can't be a Terminator. Humans can be fooled, but not dogs. As von Rossbach turned to walk away, she made up her mind. Unlocking the window, she lifted it and slipped through, easing it down behind her. "Wait," she called weakly. If he wasn't a Terminator, she had to find out what, or rather who, he was, and why he had come looking for her. He couldn't have seen her spying on him this morning, could he? Her skills were rusty, but surely not that rusty. She went to the nearest building and peeked around the corner. The man was leaning over, trying to persuade the dog to go home, though it was obvious just looking at the mutt that it didn't have one. "You've got a friend for life there," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man looked at her. Her voice had quavered a bit, and her hands were still shaking. She might as well try to use that, along with her diminutive size, to seem harmless. It might wipe that closed look off his face. "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I'm so sorry." She brushed her hair back and gave a nervous little laugh. "I thought you were someone else." She looked at him, wide-eyed, then burst out. "But you're not, obviously." "Who did you think I was?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were hard, evaluating her. She lifted her hands and then dropped them. Shaking her head, Sarah walked a few steps toward him. "Please," she said, her eyes on the ground as she walked. "I'd rather not say. I'm so embarrassed as it is. Anyway, you don't want to know about it. It's just..." She waved her hands helplessly. "Please, could we start over?" Sarah looked at him and smiled tremulously, trying to look innocent. "Who are you?" he asked, still suspicious. "I'm Suzanne Krieger," she said, holding out her hand. "That's my trucking company." "Oh, really?" He sounded dubious. "A lot of people are surprised to hear that," Sarah assured him, smiling weakly. There was an awkward moment of silence. "I just want you to know that was a very uncommon reaction," she said, twisting her fingers together nervously. "I really don't make a habit of running away from my customers. Honest." "Don't overdo it, Connor," she warned herself. "You're an American," Dieter observed. "Yes, but my husband was Paraguayan." "Was?" Dieter walked by her side as they wended their way back to the trucking company. He found her face attractive in an angular way. Her blue eyes were very expressive, and her mouth was tempting. A good figure, too, he thought. But he was still not lulled by either her fluttering manner or her refusal to explain. He noticed that she kept as far from him as she could in the narrow alley. "Yes, he died the year after he bought the company." She lapsed into silence for a few moments. "Anyway, that's enough about me," she said as they came to the open door of the garage. "What is it you came here for?" "Boy, do I want to know that." Dieter could actually feel the word sperm pressing against his teeth, but he restrained himself. "I have a shipment from the King Ranch," he said instead. "Oh yes," Sarah said with a smile. "It's in the fridge. I'll go get it for you. You know the way out front," she said with a little laugh and a gesture toward the open door to the offices. Sarah looked at him sweetly until at last he nodded and headed out to the front office. When he was gone, she leaned against the wall and allowed her shoulders to sag. How can this be? She asked herself. Her stomach clenched. He's the spinning image of no less than 2 Terminators, except for the beard. She wondered briefly if Terminators could even grow beards. He even sounds like them. Well, maybe the accent wasn't as pronounced, but in every other way, Dieter von Rossbach was a physical duplicate of the T-101s she'd known. But how? There has to be a connection. But what? Sarah brushed her hair back off her forehead and blew out her breath. It's time to discuss it with John, she thought. He'll probably have some ideas. Meanwhile, Sarah went to the fridge and took the special box out. King Ranch. Probably sperm then. The labels and stamps and customs papers all seemed authentic. So, if this was some kind of ruse, it was a very elaborate one. Also, irrelevant. No one smuggled drugs from the United States to South America, as far as she knew. So, obviously that wasn't it. And going by the paper trail, this box had traveled by legitimate courier all the way. So, Mr. von Rossbach, in his instance at least, probably was just a rancher interested in improving his cattle. She wondered why they'd never dealt with this guy before. Most likely, he'd used somebody in Asunción. It didn't really matter. Getting rid of him and returning home to John to discuss this weird situation did. Though, I have to wonder if his choosing Krieger Trucking has happenstance or if there's some motivation behind it. The coincidences were mounting up. She could feel the paranoia taking over. "Here you go," she said as she walked into the front office. Sarah picked up a clipboard from Maylinda's desk. She noticed that her hands were still shaking. Okay, so he used that, she reminded herself. I'm just a shy, decent widow doing her best. Von Rossbach stood foursquare behind the counter, his eyes never leaving her, taking in every movement, every nuance of expression. "You're making me nervous," Sarah accused as she laid down the box. She presented the clipboard to him with a pen. "Would you sign here, please?" He took them, but continued to study her. Sarah ducked her head and looked away. "Please," she said. "I would really like to know who you thought I was," Dieter said steadily. "Please explain." Sarah took a deep breath, not looking at him, and let it out, then nodded. "I can easily see why you might be offended," she said, swallowing. "Okay." Sarah paused for effect, biting her lips. "When Paul died, someone wanted to buy the company, but I wanted to keep it for our son, and because I'd put a lot of effort into it myself. This guy who wanted to buy it took my refusal personally and was very, very angry. He made threats. I told him to leave us alone." She stopped and glanced at him from the corner of her eyes. That unwavering stare of his really was making her tense. Not that I need any help with that, she thought ruefully. "You thought I was this man?" he asked. No, not exactly. Anyway, for a while, nothing happened. Then little accidents began to occur. Things went missing, and some of our shipments were hijacked. He came back and made another offer. This one was ridiculously low. Insulting, actually, and I told him to go away. She dipped her head and shrugged. That's when things began to get scary. There was this man, a big man. I began to see him everywhere, watching me, getting closer all the time. I'd be shopping for groceries, for instance, and suddenly I'd feel someone behind me, and I'd turn, and it would be him, just looking at me. One day he asked me about my little boy. Her voice broke on the last word. Sarah was proud of that touch. She hadn't been sure she could do it. She took a deep breath, blinking as though afraid there might be tears to hide. There's really not much else to tell. I decided to move the company here to Villa Hayes because I thought there'd be less competition. But I liked that it was so near a big city. I thought we'd be safe here. She gave a little laugh. I gave up smoking today, so I'm nervous as a cat at a dog fight. And when I looked up, all I could see was your outline, and... She shook her head regretfully. I panicked. I'm so sorry. I'm not ordinarily such a scaredy cat. It was like a flashback, you know? Dieter gave her a long look, revealing nothing. He watched her fidget for a few moments, then signed her form. She tore off a portion of it and gave it to him as his receipt. "Thank you," she said, smiling bravely, her heart thudding in a nerve-wracking combination of anger and fear. "Good luck evading that dog." Sarah could see the disreputable mutt waiting hopefully outside her front door. "I hope he sticks to you like a burr and gives you some horrible parasite," she thought viciously. Given her plausible explanation, and to her mind very convincing performance, she couldn't help but think of him as a bully. If she really was a helpless little widow, she'd be ready to burst into tears by now. Dieter turned to look, and his shoulders twitched. Sarah liked that. It made him seem more human, and she finally began to calm down. He picked up his box. "Hasta la vista," he said, and walked out. The dog fell in behind him, its chin a fraction of an inch from the big man's boot heel. Sarah closed her eyes slowly. Then she turned to check the clock. 5:30. "I can't keep quitting early like this," she told herself as she headed for her office. Picking up her purse and her keys, she went into the garage. "Ernesto," she called. Her voice was still shaking a little, and Sarah frowned at the evidence of her weakness. She cleared her throat. He came out from under a truck. "You are all right, Senora?" he asked, his face full of concern. "Actually, I feel lousy, Ernesto." She was willing to bet that she looked almost as bad as she felt. "I'm going home early. Can you close up for me, please? I'll lock the front door myself, if you'll take care of the back here." "Sure," he said, sitting up. "That man?" "Oh," Sarah waved a dismissive hand. "Mistaken identity. I feel like a complete fool. He's just a rancher, I guess." She shook her head. "Nothing to worry about, my friend. I'm just nervous and feeling rotten. I'll see you in the morning." "See, I hope that you feel better soon," he said, and waved to her before pushing himself back under the truck. He'd learned early in their relationship that Suzanne Krieger did not take kindly to being coddled, so showing that he was on her side was all he was prepared to do right now. But he would love to know why his tough-as-nails boss had gone running out of the garage with just a rancher in hot pursuit. Although he had to admit, at least to himself, if that man had started chasing him, he'd have run too. "Not my business," Ernesto muttered, picking up a wrench. She knew where to find him if she needed his help. Dieter tucked into his desk and booted up his computer. He had an identikit program, and he brought it up now. In about 20 minutes, he had a fair likeness of Suzanne Krieger, and made up a version with and without glasses. The woman didn't feel to him like a terrorist. There was an aura about them that Dieter could usually pick up on. Besides, females were rare among their ranks. Those who chose the terrorist lifestyle, though, tended to be excellent actresses, so he couldn't afford to eliminate the possibility solely on gut feeling. It was also possible, given that she owned a trucking company, that Mrs. Krieger was running drugs. Her overreaction today indicated that she was coming down off of something. But it might just be cigarettes, as she said. When he'd quit smoking, he'd been close to dangerous for 6 weeks. She's probably smuggling, he thought. But in Paraguay, it's more likely to be DVD players than drugs. Smuggling is the national industry, or was. Von Rossbach studied the stark portraits he'd created of Suzanne Krieger, looking for something in the images that would give him a clue. She's guilty of something, he thought. An innocent woman doesn't take off like a hare being chased by hungry hounds. She calls for help. She runs to the nearest man. She doesn't clear out for parts unknown, without even making a sound. That, he felt, was a telling detail. She knows how to run. If she didn't, I'd have caught her, and the way she moved. She had combat training somewhere. Martial arts, certainly. Dieter flattered himself that the mere sight of his face wasn't likely to send women running for their lives. Maybe she'd bumped off Paul Krieger before moving down here. Whatever. He composed a note to Jeff Goldberg, his former partner in the sector operation. "Hi, Jeff. Sorry to bother you, but I'm wondering if you can tell me anything about this woman, who currently runs a trucking company in Villa Hayes. Strangely enough, she ran from me the moment she saw me. No comments, please. And gave me a story about being threatened by some man who wanted to buy her business. She's going by the name Suzanne Krieger, widow of Paul Krieger, and she has a son. It might be nothing, but my antennae are up on this one. Looking forward to hearing back from you. Dieter. P.S. When are you and Nancy coming to my ranch to visit? Soon, he hoped. There was a lot to like about this country and this life, but after 8 months away from the sector, he was finding it incredibly dull. You could be bored in the business, or bored most of the time, but there was always an edge of anticipation. He supposed it was to be expected. Compared to his old life running down terrorists and international criminals, pursuing cattle across the Chaco was an inevitable come-down. Each day ran into the next here, with very little to distinguish them from each other. Today, though, had been exceptional, and he felt good. He might just be chasing shadows here, but at least he wasn't chasing cows. John! John! Sarah stood in the tiled and whitewashed hallway of her estancia and listened, but the house was silent. He couldn't have gone far, though. He wouldn't leave the house open like this if he wasn't in earshot. She went out onto the portal. "John!" she shouted. She heard a distant call in answer and looked in that direction. Of course, the barn. He'd been riding Linda. She leaped down the 3 steps and trotted towards his voice. Sarah found him in the paddock at the back of the barn, grooming the bay mare, who was trying to wrap her neck around him in a horsely hug. "She says that you neglect her shamefully and leave her to starve as often as not," John said with a grin, pushing the horse's big head away gently. "She lies like a rug," Sarah said, crossing her arms atop the paddock gate. "Which she might soon become if she keeps blackening my reputation that way." "You hear that, Linda?" John asked, scratching under her chin. The horse stretched her neck out in ecstasy, a foolish expression on her long face. "I may be your favorite human, but you have to know which side your hay is buttered on. This lady is your meal ticket, don't you know that?" Linda sneezed, splattering John's t-shirt with green. "Ah! Thank you, Linda," he said, holding his arms out in disgust. John whipped off his shirt and used the clean side to wipe his face and arms. Sarah gave a short laugh at his expression. "Come out of there before she starts to lick you." She opened the gate, and then she turned serious. "We have to talk." Unlike most teens, John's automatic reaction wasn't, "What am I supposed to have done now?" Instead, he asked, "What's gone wrong? How can we fix it?" He slipped through the gate and turned to fasten it behind him. Then he squinted up at the sun. "You're early," he said, almost a question. Sarah opened her mouth. Now that she was in front of him, she didn't really know how to begin. John lowered his head and raised his eyebrows. "Mom? I had a really strange experience today," she began. With one hand she brushed her hair back and frowned into the middle distance. "Strange how?" John asked. Was it getting off the caña? He wondered. DTs or some shit like that? 'Cause he didn't know if he could handle it if it was. Did you just lock them in a closet with a bag of candy and hope for the best, or what? This guy came in today to pick up a shipment, and, John, she looked him in the eye. I swear to you, he was the spitting image of a Terminator. John shook his head. He had a beard and his accent was less noticeable, but otherwise, he looked exactly like a Terminator. Sarah tightened her lips. It was obvious he was having trouble believing her. They stared at one another for a long minute, and then John shook his head as though to clear it. Doesn't necessarily mean anything, he said. Skynet may have made the Terminators up to look like pictures it had on file. It had to get those faces from someplace, right? So, it doesn't have to be a threat, right? We didn't stay alive and out of jail by treating something that looked like a threat as if it wasn't one, Sarah reminded him. I don't want this to mean anything either, but we can hardly afford to bury our heads in the sand, right? What happened? John asked, holding up his hands in a slow-down gesture. Exactly. So she told him. He was definitely human, she finished. While he was looking for me, this stray dog came along and fell in love with him, and he took the time to pet it and talk to it, and it followed him home. John spluttered a laugh. It followed him home? That doesn't sound like a Terminator, does it? She gave her son a steely look. Except he looked just like one. What's more, why hadn't she told him this in the first place? He's moved in right next door to us. John's face smoothed into a neutral expression. He said nothing. Sarah bit her lower lip. I should have told him yesterday, she thought, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. She told him about the research she'd been able to do so far. I don't want to panic or anything, but it might be time we moved on, she said, and started toward the house. Maybe we've been getting too comfortable. John trotted to catch up with her and tugged at her arm, stopping her. Mom, he said, let's not overreact here. Right now, we don't really know anything about this guy. At least, nothing bad. Let's find out who he is first, because if he's trouble and we panic and go running for our lives, that could bring him down on us. I am not in a panic, she protested. I'm saying that It's not a good idea to get too settled. A rolling stone gathers no moss. We can't afford to get complacent and all that sensible-sounding shit. But I say we can't afford to go off half-cocked. Who is this guy? And is he in fact any threat to us? If you don't know your enemy, how can you defend yourself against him, right? John looked at her, a determined look in his eyes. Sarah's face turned cold. She took a breath to speak, and John held up his hand. I'm not saying I won't go. I'm not stupid, Mom, and I would never do anything that might end with you back in an institution. But I'm not going to give up everything we've worked so hard for because you're having a bad day. Hey, Sarah said, taken aback. John hung his head. Sorry, he mumbled. You should be. She turned away and started back to the house. I've had worse days than this and kept my head, she thought. Then she stopped as an image of von Rossbach came to her. He has cop's eyes, John, she said. You're right, I am having a bad day, or I would have seen it sooner. Cop's eyes? John said. The phrase sent a chill through him. He knew exactly what she meant, had known since he was a very little kid. So, what was he picking up, Mom? Sperm, she said, and started walking again. What? John screwed up his face into a confused knot. Did you say sperm? Cattle sperm from the U.S., Sarah said over her shoulder. How old was he? John asked, catching up to her again. Maybe he's retired. A retired cop might be the most dangerous kind, she said thoughtfully. He'd have time on his hands, and probably be bored out of his skull, and he'd have contacts to ask for further information. Our cover story's pretty airtight, though, isn't it? John asked. He knew it was. He'd worked on it himself at odd moments, and if I do say so myself, it's very good. Just enough information, not too much. That was the key. As for people who used to know them in Ciudad del Este, the city was growing and changing so fast, even he had trouble finding people they knew there. And those people had been well paid to remember them and their sad circumstances. Sarah gave a weary sigh. Yes, our background should pass muster. It should. She'd worked hard enough on it. Most of the work had involved undoing some of John's airier flights of fancy. So, John concluded, we should be okay for at least a couple of weeks. So, we find out about this guy. I'll just check with my extensive social connections, Sarah said sarcastically. Mom, you don't have any social connections. Thanks for reminding me, oh fruit of my loins. John shuddered dramatically. Ew, Mom, that's gross. No, I'll check my extensive social contacts. You check your extensive underworld connections. If he's a cop, they'll know about him. Working together, we'll come up with something. Sarah grinned, feeling better for having spoken to her son. My ally, she thought, with a surge of affection. Okay, she said. We'll check him out before we act, but get used to the idea that we might have to go. Don't worry, Mom. I can have my coin collection packed up in 5 minutes and be ready to roll. Good to know, she said, and put an arm around him. She blinked in surprise. It's a little disturbing to put your arm around your son and find yourself reaching up, she thought. What? He asked. She switched to putting her arm around his waist. It's just that you're growing up. Aw, Mom. John rolled his eyes. She started up the stairs to the house. What do you want for dinner? She asked. Meat, he rumbled in a deep, deep voice. No problemo, Pumpkin. Pumpkin? What happened to you're growing up? She opened the screen door, then looked at him over her shoulder. I had to take the wind out of your sails before your ego flew away with you. He came in after her, wearing a sappy smile. A boy's best friend is his mother, he said. And don't you forget it, bucko. Go wash up. Dinner in half an hour. John gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and went down the hall. Sarah watched him go with mixed emotions. She didn't want to uproot them. She knew he'd mind it this time. Sarah allowed herself a sigh. Then it was time to stoke up the barbecue. As long as I don't feel like I'm the one turning on a spit, I should be fine, she thought.